You can tell her, you can tell her anything. She's a real good listener. You can tell her anything.
Yo, what's up? It's your girl, Father Longlegs. This is Daddy T. You know me. This is You Can Tell Me Anything. The podcast that's kind of evolved from a confessions comedy podcast to really me learning about everything there is to try to get ahead of the fall of democracy. No, that's an exaggeration, or is it? I don't know. Maybe our guest today can enlighten me a little bit because I have a special guest today, kind of following the trend of edifying myself about like technology and machine learning. Actually, this my guest today replied to a story I shared to politely correct me in a way that was not offensive. I know it's so tough when you reach out to someone to correct someone, but I say this because I don't want people to get the wrong idea. It was very helpful. And then I said you should come on the pod and explain more about your expertise, which is machine learning and tech and all this stuff I'm interested in that I talk out of my ass about. So I'm going to introduce my guest today. It is Doug Clarke. He's a media technologist and also a artist of his own. He does photos. He's a musician. He's done comedy and TV shows. What's up, Doug? How are you?
Good. How you doing? Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. Yeah. I like to start by asking for a good confession just to get started on a positive note, before you scare me with the singularity. Is there something good you want to confess?
Maybe just that, with COVID, it's been a little hard because the world is locked down a bit, and I love to travel. I've been to 43 countries so far.
Oh, wow. What's your favorite?
Say it again?
What's your favorite that you've been?
Maybe Spain or Japan always comes to mind. Bulgaria is up there. And most recently I spent time in North Korea, which is a little interesting. And
what were you doing in North Korea?
To be honest, I was invited as kind of a tag along with some other friends. They said they had
Dennis
a connection
Rodman?
and I can get in. And yeah, we went through like this Spanish guy who lives in China.
Whoa.
And flew from Beijing, left everything in Beijing. Like I literally brought a book and a camera that I had pre-approved, and that's it. No phone, nothing. And spent some time over there exploring the country with these guides, these North Korean and Spanish guides. But
interesting.
Anyway,
I feel like I'm like trying not to open that box because I'm like, there's probably so much there. But if we get there, I mean, I don't know. Well, I guess quickly because my curiosity is piqued. I have talked to people who've gone there, mostly writers who, were tagging along with a friend who had credentials and stuff. But were you there like for fun? Is that the tourism kind of branch that they like extend to foreigners to show how everything is normal there? Okay.
It really was. Yeah. It wasn't so much focused on everything being normal, but definitely focused on highlighting the positives and and traveling to very distinct sites to say like, hey, look, at least we got this, or we're doing great here. So,
was it strange? I mean, were you able to get an accurate like image of everything, or did they really just like usher you around to approve places?
I feel like I did get an accurate image because it's very hard to hide things in plain sight.
Yeah.
Meaning that like one of the things I noticed that there's very, very few people kind of in the country. I mean, we went to many different cities and I saw so few people. But I really got to know my North Korean hosts, and really I kind of became, I think, their favorite in the group. I'm just very open. I just love talking a lot, and they allowed me to take more pictures than probably anyone. I have about 2,700 photos out of there. A lot of stuff I wasn't supposed to take pictures of. So I can put into a photo blog later.
Yeah, I'll link that. That sounds interesting. I mean, did they say there was anything you couldn't talk about or post, or they were just like, hopefully you liked our hospitality so much?
It was more stuff they were almost embarrassed about, meaning like they said, do not take picture of any of the military, because when you really look up close to like the soldiers, they're all wearing like kind of these almost like cheap felt suits. They have no armaments at all, no individually. They say, don't take pictures of construction or anything that's not looking great. The buildings don't look that great. It's more like just trying to kind of like hide their...
Wow, that's like when you're like going through your phone and you're trying to show your friend someone you're dating. You're like, not that picture. Hold on. I'll find a good one. Ugh, not this one. No, this is the wrong angle. I swear, he's really cute usually, but...
yeah, exactly.
Wow. That's so wild. I mean, gosh. I mean, I went to China I've been to China a couple times in different areas, but I will say like when you said there's not a lot of people, which obviously China is full of people, but there's certain areas that feel like that, especially in the like in the French Quarter in Shanghai. There's really nice fancy areas that have these huge department stores. I remember taking videos on my phone because they really encourage, like, if you just look like you're a tourist who's like, ooh, this is cool, for you to take pictures. If you look like you're being sketch about it, they'll get mad. But I can't find these photos anymore because I think my phone crashed. But it was wild because there's like so many, it's so fancy, so luxurious, and there's a ton of like employees there, like cleaning every couple feet, and there's just like so few actual shoppers or citizens. It's a lot of like tourists, so you kind of get this sense that it's like this facade for, I mean, it's real in that like you can go in and buy a Gucci bag, but like it's all stores I'm like, I can't afford this, and there's nobody here, so how are these shops open? They're clearly subsidized by the government.
Yeah, there's a very strange, it's funny to equate this to like a Gucci bag or something, but I was there on Kim Jong-il's birthday.
Oh gosh.
And part of the activity was to go view his body.
Oh no.
And so they brought us in, and it was a room full of all these like foreign dignitaries and different people, like, and I was talking to people from Australia and Canada and all this. And then they kind of line us up. We go in, we have this protocol to like bow. He's in a glass coffin. It's very like Snow White-ish. And then you go through, but then after that was done in the morning, they kind of shoved everyone out, and then the place was empty. It shut down. I'm like, wait, that was it? There's no one else viewing it? It's his birthday. I thought it was a all day, all country thing. And it was just for us. That was very bizarre.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Gosh. Well, yeah, hopefully, I don't know. I don't know what to say to that. I mean, that's a cool experience you had. I'm sure there's a lot more that to the situation that if we start talking about, I will probably get us way off topic. So let's go back onto topic. So I understand you're a media technologist. I just want to fill the listeners in and maybe start from here of how we started talking, because I posted a story about, or it was a podcast, I believe it was Washington Square. Is it? Wait, sorry. Wall Street Journal. I'm thinking, I went to NYU and we had Washington Square. Wall Street Journal's tech news podcast, or the Vergecast, I don't remember.
New York Times. Maybe.
Was it? Okay, maybe it was New York Times.
I think so.
Gosh, there's a few that I listen to on the reg that I rotate. So it's probably the New York Times if that's what you remember, the daily. And they...
Yes, that was them.
Yes, okay, so they kind of highlighted... Something I've been talking about is like I roughly kind of jokingly put like big data and tech and machine learning all together. I know they're all separate terms, but like there's sort of this world that a lot of people are confused by. But I've been talking a lot about how, fundamentally a lot of tech, as we design it, it can actually, the system itself can be flawed, but we start to trust it more because it's automated. So this episode talks about how there was facial recognition software being used by law enforcement. And this was like a best case scenario, I would say. Well, I wouldn't say best case, but best case scenario given the mistake where they, the police like owned up to it. But, obviously it happens often where purposefully police get it wrong. So it wouldn't surprise me if when the computer gets it wrong, they just ignore it. But in this particular story, the police arrested someone who was just not even his face just came up because it looked like, I guess the computer thought he looked like an actual suspect from a camera, but so much it was so off that when they actually got him in there and looked at the photo, he was like, this is clearly not me. And they looked again, they're like, oh yeah, you're right. And they just blamed the computer. So I shared this story saying people should listen to it as an example of this. And you responded saying, because I also said I think a lot of systems are inherently biased because they're created by more of like sort of a white norm like group of people. But you corrected me and said that's not actually true. It's actually a pretty diverse field with a lot of people of color who are coding and writing and training. So I did correct myself there, but I wanted to hear more because there is an inherent bias, and I think you also
there are a lot
on
of
that.
biases.
But now I'm more curious, like, okay, so what is it about this tech world that feels so limiting that becomes homogenous, even if there's people from diverse backgrounds? As someone from the Bay, I kind of understand that feeling of like aesthetic diversity that's not truly diversity of thought. So anyways, that's a long monologue, but my point is this is how we met, and I'd love to start there. So can you tell me a little bit more about what you know about like your experience working here and how these systems become so biased?
Well, overall, I mean, I think the thing I really want to highlight in this conversation is that you said it. You had a great statement right there, where you said that new technology is flawed, yet we somehow trust it a little more because it's automated. I mean, I never thought of that statement as is, but that's one of the most perfect statements around what we're talking about. And I personally,
well, in a way, we kind of trust. Sorry, I just want to add to that because in a way, that is how I feel about parenting. I mean, so much of this pod is talking about our patterns that we learn from childhood, and so much of my own like growth in the last year, I would even say, because 2 years ago I was like still blaming my mom, jokingly, but really. But now I'm like, I truly forgive anyone who's like added to patterns I have and kind of come out on the side where I'm like taking more ownership of my code, if that makes sense. But I do think this idea of like trusting the automation is really like parallel to early development, like childhood. You have to, for survival, trust your parents because you really don't know the world, but they're inherently flawed. But you're not allowed to realize that until you get older and have more skills. So your brain is kind of set up to trust them for safety. And I think we're kind of mirroring that a little bit with computers. Like instead of them being our babies, we're kind of treating them like parents when it should be the opposite.
Right. It absolutely should be the opposite. It's funny because I always say when the parent thing, and to take your analogy a little further, I always say when I grew up, I said, oh, parents are just adults who have a few more years experience than we do. So they're really not these like super figures. They're just a little more advanced. Now, when we talk about computers, like you said, it's the opposite. We're actually looking up to them, but they're just babies. They're just, all these algorithms are learning from us, right?
Yeah.
And so I did want to get into some detail. And what I wanted to do was also kind of state my position on it. I'm one of those really weird, I don't know if there's anyone like me, but like a technologist who's actually very anti-technology, very critical of technology. I kind of long for the days where we just read books and look at maps and have conversations in person.
Maps are technology. What do you define as technology?
I guess I define it as like
innovation. Are you against like electronic technology? Because to me, like technology captures innovation, and a map is an innovation.
I think what I'm talking about for me, it's like almost like tactile, experiential versus simulated. That kind of boundary. But when I'm critical of on technology side is really ethics behind technology. So I think that in other things you've posted, I mean, it's attracted me a lot, just being very critical of like big tech like Facebook and Amazon about their practices and kind of what they know they're doing versus what they purport they know they're doing to Congress, things like that. I mean, it really, those are some topics that really get me going. But I want to hone in specifically on machine learning and kind of what we know about it, how it kind of came about, the ethics a little bit behind it. I have some kind of principles that maybe we could start with that are more like fundamental.
Yeah. Let's start with your principles.
So like machine learning is really, the ideas have been around for actually a very long time, probably since the 70s. A lot of the principles that we actually work from are that old. They're 50-year-old ideas. The reason why we're able to actually look and implement them now more has to do with the computing power that we have now, meaning that in order to do a good machine learning algorithm, you need a huge amount of parallel algebraic processing. That's where GPUs have come into play, meaning GPUs are like basically computer graphics cards because they have to render a whole screen kind of at the same time. Then that allowed the parallel processing that enabled things like machine learning. I won't get too into the deep tech about that.
No worries. I mean, we sort of have a background of this, but in terms of, I'm more interested. Okay, so let's get into, because I know we can really get lost in sort of like the big ideas here. I think overall people have an understanding that, or the way that, I guess if they've listened to all these episodes, they have an understanding of the way machine learning works. And the way I describe it is more for layman's terms. I know this probably isn't the way you would learn in, at Stanford or whatever. But it's like neural nets, basically artificial neural nets. And instead of having one equation, it's like a system that adapts to the problem. So that's the way I've kind of described it. I often describe it as like, when your brain is on acid or shrooms, you kind of expand in your brain, and it's actually, you're creating new equations to solve new problems and like rework the entire system, but you're still you. So it's not like you're changing your personality. I mean, maybe, but I don't believe this now gets into like nitty gritty of like what your belief system is. Personally, I believe no matter what you are, that's who you are. You're just finding like a ball that gets worn down is still a ball, or, you know. So I think you're just getting either like improving your speed of like pattern recognition or processing, changing negative patterns to positive or vice versa, you know, if it's unfortunate, but you're still you. And I think that's the way I look at machine learning. And I think people are scared of it because a lot of people don't understand how the human brain works. And it doesn't help that really, like you say, tech is so separate. Like I think you have to learn ethics to get into this, but it's so much just like a checklist as opposed to a true interdisciplinary, this is my understanding, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as opposed to a true interdisciplinary field where you really understand like biology and like even marine life and the brain development, I think has so much to add to the way we design tech, but there's only so much time that we have to teach people things.
But I think that, I mean, I want to really, you touched on something I want to touch on as well. I want to highlight a difference, though, between kind of like the way that the human mind develops, like you're talking about, the way that we learn, and the way that like a machine learning application will learn. And the difference is that the most successful machine learning algorithms have to be generalized. They actually have to address every case, every situation. So those inherent biases that get built in that we don't want, they're undesirable because they are a little more reflective of kind of ourselves. Meaning that if I'm going to, for example, teach a speech recognition software or something like that, then if I focus too much on my perception of the world and how I hear speech spoken, I'm not going to have a very successful algorithm because it's not going to recognize a lot of speech that I didn't take into consideration as I built the system, right?
Maybe, but so, I guess it depends on what your goal is, because, for example, if we assume that law enforcement is there to keep the peace and people safe, then yes, we want generalization. But as we're finding now, there's more underneath the surface than has been, you know, previously reported, and sometimes it is more about power or finding ways to continue a structure of power in which they might not blatantly say this, but what algorithms will get rewarded, and the contracts, you know, the big money is like the ones that do more what they actually want, even if they're not saying it. So we may lean closer to, you know, algorithms that reward more, you know, reward like putting the burden of proof onto the, you know, suspect over the law enforcement or whatever. So I mean, let's get into specifics, because
sure.
So wait, did you say all your 3 principles? What are your 3 principles? I feel like I passed.
I don't think I had like three principles.
Or what were your principles?
Just. I mean, I think it's fine. We could just kind of progress through the conversation. Okay. But we can. What I was going to say though is that as far as machine learning, to back up a little bit, a lot of the foundation is in academia. Academia is still kind of the firm kind of stake in the ground of where a lot of this stems from, meaning that it kind of doesn't matter who takes and develops an application. So many principles have been shared among a global community of academics. And that's because there's so many aspects of machine learning that have to be honed, meaning that there's, you don't just end up training an algorithm. You actually have to build the algorithm first. And that's where I wanted to get a little bit into what data is available to kind of build an algorithm, and then what data is available to kind of train an algorithm. And that's what gets into availability of that data, rights, things like that. And then that could start to introduce biases. Sure. I don't want to get too in the weeds with it, but yeah.
No, we want to get in those specifics. But okay, one thing you said, so you talked about very academic, and I just want to sort of clarify that, because to me, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm from the Bay, so I just happen to have touched on it peripherally, and maybe that's where, like, to me, I say, like, I'm a layman and I don't have any knowledge, but I do love reading about this and I've researched it for fun. Like, I read Kai-Fu Lee's book, and I think he has a good sort of accessible way of explaining it to people. And I think that it should be something more like medical school, where you have to, it's like a secondary, like, you have to have a foundation of humanities. But I know it's like nobody wants to go to school, and it's expensive for so long, and you just want to get straight to it. And there's such a demand for, you know, to hire people, that it's it's more profitable to graduate school quickly and get in and take these classes
exactly
after. But then I think so much of like your life experience is going to influence the questions you ask when you're training and writing code, that you just can't teach truly until you've lived a bunch of different experiences. And I'm barely correct in my approach to life, so I can only imagine what a 22-year-old straight out of school is going to be writing. So,
and we're limited by what we're aware with, and we're biased by our own perception in every respect. Meaning that, let's actually right down into facial recognition. I think it's a good way to do it. Like, so in the beginning, yes, like there could be, we see with our eyes. We have a three-dimensional color, detailed view of a person's face, right? Taking a full resolution photo into an ML process, which they call computer vision, anything having to do with imagery, it's not actually an efficient or good way to process that and start to break down what would make a face recognizable. What actually has to happen is a bunch of, like you said, like a bunch of different nodes that do different distinct operations. Also, there's something called convolutions. Convolutions are like where you have to actually break down the data into small chunks of data so you can even process that. Meaning that one convolution may, take kind of turn something into a full like grayscale, and then say like you have different depths of saturation, color saturation. Another one may take, like vertical slices and say, I see that, these vertical lines that will distinguish where a bridge of a nose is, where your sides of your face are, your ears are, things like that. Another one for horizontal lines. It breaks it down so much into things that the computer will be able to process, and that's where the academia comes into play. And people have done, published papers after papers about, which convolutions work, which neural networks work, where you pair these different things in what order, right? And a lot of that is developed and done under circumstances and under examples of like who knows what they were using as their materials to actually develop those ideas. So if they're in Asia, they're using a bunch of probably Asian faces that they had access to. If they're in Europe, they're probably using a bunch of like, Eastern European faces and, whatever it is, right?
It's like those apps from Russia that'd be like Face App. They're just to collect faces. Yeah. And
then that's the thing though, is that there's a little loophole. When you're developing your algorithms and you're developing these neural nets, you can kind of use whatever imagery you want. I mean, you could just scrape Google, you could do whatever, because you're just creating your actual neural network. You're not actually training it yet, because then you could throw away all that data. And now if you want to train it, that's where you have to use images and training material that, you have rights to, that you have access to. So that's a really interesting distinction, meaning that, there's data sets that are publicly kind of available that these academic communities have put together for people, like where they have kind of documented clearance of rights or whatever.
Sure.
But when you look at a training set, it can't reflect necessarily, like in the US, for example, like we have so many white people, so many, black people, so many, there's like this aggregation or this breakdown of kind of, population, right? Like a neural network can't, if it's going to be effective in facial recognition, it can't reflect that breakdown. It has to have as many faces of whatever you want to capture as the other. Meaning you can't have like 60% white people, then only 30% black people, because the neural network doesn't know that that's a white person, that doesn't know it.
But I think this is where we can learn from neural networks. So I think there's kind of two things you brought up. One is like a very good point of like where it's in the academic world, like everything has a cost, right? You can't just bring the computer out and live 5 years and capture every face. You have to actually get the faces. So that is like a real problem. But the other part is like, I think as humans, as much as we are relying and, in quotes, trusting automation, we also at the same time paradoxically believe we're gods in a way. So like we think in designing the computer that we're already finished, when really like obviously humans have so much to grow. Like within your own life, your brain is constantly growing. And I think one part we can learn from the machines is the way like maybe race isn't that important in how you perceive a person. Like if we're having to teach a computer races, like maybe it was a construct to begin with. But then there are realities of different facial features that could actually
Yes.
help. Like, oh, are there certain face types that are more prone to allergies in the, in the summertime? And, is there a way to hone that algorithm in to help? I think this is where we get caught up with our biases, because as a person, I might feel ethically, as a human being, that's exactly what a human would say. I'm not a robot. As a human being, I feel like you can get into some murky ethical territory if you're trying to do research on face types and you're constantly getting more of one demographic or one ethnicity because of the way we perceive race. But
Yes,
then,
exactly.
as we talk about robots, like these robots are like, what's a race? And you're like, let me teach you. And you're like, wait a minute, why? Why are we trying to teach the robots how to be racist?
And that's the thing, is that, like, so let's say that I'm providing training material. I think I'm doing a good job because I have representation of, grown-ups and children and males and females and, non-gender specific and every race. But then the computer is just doing these convolutions, right? It's breaking down these images into this data. And maybe I've completely missed some other characteristic that is completely not based in race at all. Maybe I'm not taking into consideration like genetic disorders or people with burns, people with scars, people with
redheads,
different,
they often get overlooked.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's true though, because the computer is not, like you said, it's not seeing the world the way that I've been raised to see the world. And so then if by simply doing these categories of representation that I think, even if I think I'm doing a great job and I'm being super comprehensive with it, to the computer, it's like it's like what the way it sees the world, the computer vision sees the world, you could be missing huge swaths of groups.
Yes.
So therefore,
you bring up such a good point, because I've sometimes I have never quite put this fully into like this theory into words in a way that makes sense, but maybe I'll try now, because sometimes thoughts ruminate and they're not quite cooked and I don't talk about them, but I'm like, okay, let me see if this one makes sense. So the thing is, like, oftentimes you see in movies or even like, in like the trope of like, oh, what did this, like, what did the robber look like? And the first thing people want to know is the race. Like, was it a white man, a black man? But then then also like working in Hollywood, I constantly get called in for ethnically ambiguous, even though I'm like, I think I read Asian. So I don't know, like it's truly a nightmare. But what that tells me is like, it's not objective, right? Someone could read as Hispanic and they're not. And then all of a sudden you have this like category and you're totally looking in the wrong place. And I would say that's not what's the motivation to me is like, when you're writing a computer code, you're not doing it just because we want to see if we can make fake humans, even though that's interesting to me. Like, it costs too much money to just do it for fun. So we're usually doing it with a purpose. So that also informs me like, well, what's the purpose of a human brain for categorizing, right? At one point, it made sense to consider an entire race of people who are very different from you as enemies. Maybe like when there was wartime. We're not quite in that time anymore, and this might be an outdated perception. But I have a follow-up solution. I think, okay, so this is my theory. I think the way we perceive the world, like you say, like we're taught this way. But there's also things we completely ignore that are still there, like tall and short. A very, very tall person, a very, very short person, you would probably like attach to your idea of them. But for the most part, when you think about your friends, you're not like, I've got 5 tall friends and 4 short friends and 10 medium friends. Like, you just don't. Like, it's not a category. Unless, I don't want to generalize. Some, if you're a very tall model who cares a lot, you might notice it. But if it's not at all on the top of your like characteristics list, you might even just categorize it as like people taller than me, people shorter than me. Or you might not even clock it at all, even though the fact is there. Like, that's what I would call a data set that exists that you've not truly like processed to make any decisions with. But a computer, like you said, needs to be trained, right? It needs to be told what data sets to look for. But wouldn't it make more sense if a facial recognition software was designed to find suspects, to look for more objective facts like height? Like, if you're looking for a man that's 5'8", I mean, if the computer, let's say in this world the computer is right, it's 5'8". That helps so much more than like, I think he's black. And it's like, well, what if you're wrong? Like, we're trusting one person's opinion of race. Meanwhile, we're just looking in a totally different race. So that's what's baffling to me when I talk about bias, is like, we're training them based on our structures of the world. And
yes, exactly.
Like, what would a computer think is more useful? Like, I don't
You know,
know.
I mean, it's funny because even thinking about that, like, I mean, to be honest, I don't want to put anyone's idea. I don't want to put any ideas in any law enforcement center or anything. But even though, like, the way that someone walked in the video would be more useful
Way more
than,
useful.
you know.
Totally way more useful. Like there's so many other things. Like, they're like, do they have a smell? I mean, I don't know, I'm just thinking more objective things that would like follow that actual individual person and make them more distinct.
A unique person, whatever, right?
Yeah, as actually an identical twin, I do think about this a lot because I think growing up, I've always tried to differentiate myself. But yeah, to a facial recognition software, I think we'd be the same. And how do you even parts of our personality are the same. So we've always looked to differentiate ourselves through this like feeling of like, I don't know, is that the ego? I don't know. Like, how do I differentiate myself as a person in this world? And it's not looks, not for me, because I literally was born with a copycat. So I think we overlook this, and I don't think it means the technology is flawed. I just think we have so far to go. But if we don't accept, we also personally as humans have these blind spots, I think we're going to be like, well, it's done. Because imagine if a computer was like just telling us all how racist we were. I think it would make people uncomfortable. So people kind of stop before they push past their blind spots.
And it's even tricky to even talk about this. I'm even kind of prepping for this today. I'm like, I don't want to say anything that like, tries to, that gets into that comfortable territory.
But computers are allowed to make mistakes. So I think that's one thing that we don't allow ourselves to do. And for many reasons, someone in power should not be allowed to make as many mistakes as someone not, especially if it's life or death. But I do think as like us having a conversation, I think that fear can be paralyzing. So I almost want to say like, put the fear aside, and then, obviously we'll both be prudent with, I would never put something out that would make you sound bad. But to me, my instinct is that you're approaching this with a genuine, thirst for knowledge and to understand. And I think that's following that thirst rather than following the fear is a stronger way to learn.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my objective, and this is where we can kind of get into this later in the conversation, is that recognizing all of this, I always want to be very, very careful to recognize and fully understand where we are in reality so we don't misapply it. I mean, applying these very imperfect systems to something like law enforcement right now is so unethical to me. Mm-hmm. It's ridiculous. So, I mean, that's one way to look at it. But one thing I do want to mention before we get there is, you probably heard then, you probably discussed the Turing test. You know what that is, right? So Turing test is like,
to
measuring kind of
fool a human.
Yeah, measuring a machine. And that was actually how they started a lot of times. It's like, how well is this machine learning application doing? It's like, well, you compare it to a human under the same conditions. So like for facial recognition, you say, you've given these people match up, these faces to these people. How well does the human do? They're not going to do perfectly, right? Mm-hmm. So it used to be that you judge a machine learning algorithm by how close to a human it is. And that's turned out to be a really inappropriate, weird way to judge it because of these things that we are part of.
What kind of humans are you looking at? Yeah. Well, also there's a project at Harvard, I think, and if anyone's interested, I think it's just a data collection. So you will be giving your data, but you'll see what I mean. It's not bad. It's a cognitive bias research project where you can go take different cognitive bias tests and, it can be anonymous. But the idea is to, if you're willing to look at yourself, see what kind of biases you have. And there's anything from looking at queer people, looking at races, and it uses pictures. And it is going to be uncomfortable because it's asking you to judge by pictures. And the whole point is to just be, it's okay. Like it's for research. And the idea is not to be right or wrong. It's to see where you fall compared to other people and to show how we're all different in perceiving different faces. I did it and it told me that I had a slight bias towards gay people over straight people. And I was like, that seems about right. But because it does this thing where it tries to get you to press, it'll first have you press like good, gay, bad, straight, or whatever, and then it switches it, and then it sees like what's easier for you, and it's kind of like a very, very like rudimentary. I don't think this test is very advanced, so I'm sure there's a lot of blind spots, but it kind of highlights like if you're jumping really quick to click the one you already believe versus like it takes a second for your brain to be like, wait, bad, gay, no, so.
But I think that, this now learning that the Turing test is, like you said, it almost confirms, it almost perpetuates that we want to instill these biases in these machine learning algorithms. It's like, as we get away from that, we can say, no, well, if we want to actually take human bias away from it, it means looking at the objectives, at the training material as the machine would. As you understand that, then it becomes very, very difficult to come up with the training material that you need to do it properly under the constraints of the timelines that you're working with.
Well,
so
you're
that's
kind
where
of telling it everything you're kind of telling yourself everything I've ever known is may not be. You're questioning everything, which is good to do, but at a certain level, it can make you feel crazy. It unravels everything. But I just want to clarify, like, my opinion on all this is not that things are bad. It's that things should progress. So I actually think a lot of what you described, like the Turing test, all this, was kind of a necessary first step for us to get here.
Yes,
I don't think we
agree.
would have found these problems had we not taken that step. And we're so much further into technology than we were like 20 years ago. And like you said, AI, machine learning has been around for a long time, but it really didn't pick back up. Like there was a time when it was not that profitable to get into. And then, it was all about hard, like, because my dad used to work in Silicon Valley. So he was really into neural nets and then was just a little early for this. And then it was all about like, IC chips, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And now we're back because there's more capability. Yep. So I think that this is all necessary.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. But there's an inertia there that we have to really work through because you had like 50 years of some ideas, then you get to really put them into practice. Now we're discovering these unexpected, components, and we have to kind of work to undo that while things are accelerating. So it
kind of
does
like
become
back to
difficult.
parenting. You can't really just undo it. You can make mistakes that the people do all the time, but you can't just undo it. But you can do the work to reprocess trauma and fix your relationships, but it's not like a simple button. But okay, I have a question that's more positive. So given all of the biases, can you give me, or are there examples of like kind of like apps or groups that are doing this ethically that you think would be a good way to highlight how to do it? Because I don't really think the answer is that this just sucks overall. I think that's just, we have to be like aware of how we're handling it, but I imagine there's people who are a little more socially conscious. Or does it not quite exist, and what would that look like?
I mean, it does exist, but it's in much less flashy applications than we care about as much. Like, for example, I mean, I didn't want to get into like kind of the work that my company coworkers do and stuff, but I mean, there's like things like driving monitoring systems. So when you're driving, it makes sure that, you're staying awake, and if you're kind of nodding off, then it lets you know, and, you've got to pull over, things like that, or like things like, for home security, where it detects, is that really a person outside your house, or is it just the tree, the animal, the wind, nice. Whatever, like, incorporating sound, things like security, where it incorporates the sound of your voice and your fingerprint, and, like multi-factor authenticating different things. So there are like almost like just little simple tricks that really could enhance people's lives and functions and things that they deal with every day. It's that when we get into these more hairy situations with facial recognition, where you're really identifying like a distinct person as opposed to a behavior or a situation, right? That's where I think that gains more attention, right? But it also gains a lot of that negative attention because there's so many ways it can go wrong.
It's almost like, this might be a bit of a jump, but so you can totally correct me and you don't have to agree with me, but it's almost like when we're trying to create a system that's like a one-stop shop, like an answer or secret key to everything, that's where we fail. Like, that's kind of literally what Amazon sounds like. And then you get these specific ones where it's like, an app that's designed to keep you awake while you drive. Like, there's probably so much that goes into that because already your body's trying to do that. Like, but it's so much more specific, and it's not meant to be a foolproof. Like, you should still try to stay awake. You know what I mean? So
yes, exactly.
I think when we rely only on these things, then we kind of lose a little sight of just how flawed our own perceptions are. Like, even if you saw, I don't know, I love to ask questions because it's like, I'm a twin, right? Like, even if you saw someone rob you and they looked exactly like the person, you're like, that's them. But then what if I told you they're twin? What if now I told you they're triplets? Like, it could there's so many, it's not that you're wrong or even that you're biased. Like, you only knew what they look like. But if I suddenly reveal the information.
There's that Turing test,
Yeah, but let's say we're now in a town of twins and you already knew you were in a town. You might already be like, oh, hold on, is this a twin? So you're not stupid. Like, you're not stupid for not knowing everything, but you actually do process information. So, like, if you went into a town that had, you're not allowed in unless you've got at least 3 other multiples who look like you, then when you get robbed, you're immediately going to be like, okay, well, I'm going to assume that they have to be, there's more of these.
Yeah.
So I think that we forget that like computers aren't stupid, but we just don't always have all the info.
Yeah. And I think that this is where I get really critical of, like someone like Facebook, a company like Facebook, because when you think about, they're the only ones really out of like, when I think of like the big tech ones that I worry about with machine learning, it's like Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Tesla, like all those. It's with Facebook, it's like from the get-go, when people were signing up for Messenger things, they freak out because like, oh, they're saying they own my image and all that stuff. And it wasn't that. They weren't going to like take your image and sell it to someone else for like an ad in some other country. It was that they're saying, you're allowing us all rights to use your image for whatever training, whatever things that we want to do. So when you look at Facebook, they literally have everyone's data to the nth degree.
Yeah.
And no one else does. to that
and even if you're not on it,
and no one else
if a friend
has
of yours is on it and they upload a picture of you, then you're on there. And they can even tag you. So it's like, and even if they don't tag you, like you're showing up in multiple friend groups. Now, like if a computer can be like, oh, so-and-so tends to hang out with these 3 people who are all on Facebook, who are all going to this party, most likely she'll be there. Mm-hmm. Like it's so much, that's why I'm not offline, is because even though I am very conscious of privacy, I am just like, well, they want to know, they'll know. So I'm just going to be more conscious about like how I live my life. Like I don't really think like what's online, what's offline, because I kind of think it's all connected at this point. So I just think, okay, if there's anything I don't like out there, I should probably just not be that at all to begin with, which is, I think, what we should be doing when it comes to computers. But I think we're more focused on image than actual behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I think that what comes with that, though, is that there's this real, like everything that Facebook creates, it's not just the image recognition thing, it's everything. The communities they create, all their algorithms, they're all reflecting this human behavior and meeting certain objectives. So like, for example, to go off a little bit like on the way that you kind of create echo chambers in Facebook, right? It's like, okay, the algorithm says whatever the person seems to excite the person, whatever gets them clicking more, whatever gets them on more, like feed more of that back to them, right? And so you do that, and it turns out that it's a lot of things that are like political, a lot of things that are anger inducing, a lot of things that like are triggering, literally, right? And so with that comes a huge responsibility to deal with it. And to do it in a way where you're transparent with your users and with the people that are taking advantage of that. And what happens is when you're outside of that and you're trying to do like ethical and machine learning in ways that we're talking about, where, we recognize these issues, try to do better, right? It's like, it's hard when you have this like a kind of monolithic behemoth of like, that has all the data. You're trying to get some of the data, you're trying to model things correctly. I'm not complaining here, but I guess I'm not sure what I'm getting at, but it's a challenge, right?
Well, do you really think, because this is more of like a devil's advocate question, and I'm sure it's not really how the industry looks at it, but do you really think more data is always better data? This is kind of a loaded question.
It is because, yes, because more data is a diversity of data. And that's where things are really key. It doesn't matter to me, like back to the faces. If I have a billion, white male, over 30 faces, it doesn't do me much good, to my generalized applications.
Well, I guess I should phrase it in more, okay, I'm going to try to make my question more specific and not so philosophical and big, because there's so many big questions. But I can always try to bring it, there's like a reason I'm asking this, is because everything to me is going to be layered or filtered through my lens, which is more about like how I interact with the world as a human. And I know that's not how everyone views technology, but that's how I do it. So again, that's my bias, my cognitive bias. But I ask that because as a human, when I view my data, like so-and-so, for example, if you're someone in your 20s and you've dated like, let's say you had like 8 shitty relationships, and that would be like more data, right? And you'd be like, I know what I want, I know what I don't want, but they're all shitty, repetitive patterns of your like, unsolved trauma from childhood, right? Let's say you just constantly end up in these insecure attachments, versus you really take the time after one bad relationship to like learn about yourself and go, what happened here? Let me dissect this. Let me understand, what are my patterns? What are their patterns? not victim blaming, but just really like doing an audit. And then I hate that I said audit because that's what Scientologists say.
I understand that. Yeah.
But that's very annoying. That now I kind of get why they use that word. You do a little credit check on your emotions, and afterwards you go, okay, so actually what I really am looking for is love and respect or whatever, and I don't have that. So now you have your second data set, which is specifically looking for love and respect. But this is with a goal in mind, and I know not all algorithms start with those. But to me, I would argue that more data is not better data if you don't know how to like filter it and drive it closer to your goal.
But that's more poor utilization of that data. I think that more data is still useful. Let's say something I did want to touch on is everything we're talking about as far as machine learning, I didn't mention this earlier, it's called supervised learning. That's kind of 99% of the applications out there. That's when you kind of know the outcome, meaning that, given this, I need this, given this, I need this. And that's the training, right? You're supplying both of those things. There's a whole area called unsupervised learning where you kind of create something out of nothing. And there's a little bit of that, but it's not nearly as understood. So given supervised learning, given everything we're talking about, in a way, all you can ever do to start is to take data that you have and describe it better and recreate the same thing over and over again. There's very little room for creatively going somewhere unless you decide then to creatively go somewhere and very purposely take the known data and then use supervised learning to say, but I want to take it to this unknown, better place. A really good example I could think of is this, is something that Facebook uses. It's where you can take a 2D picture and then make it 3D. So that's something that is, it uses supervised learning. How they do that is, they'll take 1,000 million pictures, which was taken stereoscopically, meaning taken with 2 cameras. So you get a true 3D image. But then they train that given only the left one, this is your result. Left one, this is your result, right? And then you can create something new out of less, create something more out of less. But you need more data to do that, because as long as you're programmed it to be, with the correct objective, with the right direction, recognizing what you have, more data will still get you there better than less data.
The first thing I thought of when you said making 2D pictures 3D was just like, oh my God, Snapchat is going to be such a nightmare once they figure out how to do, just like all the unsolicited 3D dick pics.
Jesus.
But I think that's really interesting. That's not quite what I meant, but I think that definitely now opens up a new door of something to consider for me. But I think I was thinking more I'm thinking in terms of our limitations, instead of like how you describe you can't just feed a computer 5% of this, 10% of this. You have to feed it all. But also it makes you start wondering, but there are all these questions, right? Do we have all the case of the relationships? I'm going to use the example. If I only as a human had these shitty relationships and never had the good model of love, I might think that I've got a good sample size and I kind of can now figure out the best and worst case scenarios based on all my data, because I would think men suck or whatever. This is a very general sort of basic girl, hetero, whatever, just to keep things simple. Because I'm very homogeneously in this scenario dating kind of similar people, but thinking they're different. But now let's say I open up with new information, learning the pattern I've been doing is actually a bad model, and there's this other model I didn't even know existed, but was for whatever reason never drawn to or kept from me. And now I've opened up, it's almost like you unfolded a brochure and you're oh, there's actually more to this map than I thought. So now it's not that the more data was bad, but the data was all coming from one corner. Right. But how do you know that? We don't know that. So I'm saying sometimes it could use more guidance. I think humans do know a little bit more than we think, but I think it takes a lot of self-checking.
But that's where we're saying that's where maybe machine learning algorithm can take you away from the human mistakes we keep making, meaning that, we know patterns, we know how to repeat them. If the machine learning algorithm is meant to just keep repeating the pattern, it's going to do that. That's what I'd say is a kind of a bad algorithm for this application. But if it sees that you have this pattern and it's happened 20 times in the last, 5 years, and then it knows that there's a better way given someone with that pattern, then it could lead you somewhere better. And then that's where I'm saying that more data is better.
Yes,
where you want
I agree. More, but I think it's kind of widens the way we think about it, because, and it now I'm opening up a whole nother thing, but just even the idea of law enforcement and this facial recognition, is the goal just to find the suspect, or is there a world where like the next goal is to have less crime, right? So like, are there ways, I mean, not right away, but are there ways as you develop this AI to actually build it there instead of having like two different algorithms? Like, and I think there are, because not only, like you said, could you monitor things that we didn't think of, like, is there a pattern we didn't even recognize? Like, oh, people tend to come rob this store right after, or right before rent day, you know, oh shit, maybe that we have a problem with, you know, a housing crisis. And these are things that obviously I know it's not the law enforcement's job to think about, but a computer who's not getting paid more or less to recognize different patterns can just be like, found this, like found out that, you know, a lot of people come in and tend to be like injured. So maybe there's a discrimination for them getting work, or they tend to be this. And it starts recognizing like across all the stores in this area that tend to be robbed around this time. And actually this is, landlords are getting richer based on this data, and maybe there's a disparity, and it starts seeing the things that we as humans don't see.
Yeah, it's almost like that's where like the ethics of our own objectives and our own patterns, and when we want machine learning to help reinforce that, that's where it gets dangerous, right? That's where it gets bad. Meaning that, like, for example, when I'm thinking again about the law enforcement using facial recognition, it's like, I mean, I know of a company very particular, and I won't say I'm just a badmouth company, but they were featured on a John Oliver episode, so you can look them up. They sell to law enforcement, right? Something that they do is when they develop their algorithm, they scraped every picture on Facebook, every picture on the internet. They use that to demo. And so it's like, oh, look, you can get any face. And it's like, now let's train it with your database. And they have all the driver's license pictures and from the DMV, they have all the mugshots that they've captured. Those are like extremely one-dimensional, face front, you know, like whatever. Law enforcement doesn't really care about how limited that is. They don't care about, you know, they're like, oh, we have this new tool and it's going to help us catch more bad guys, whatever it is. It's the same. What I'm saying is it's the same natural bias, the same procedural bias, the same, you know, like good old police work, you know, all the stuff that has never worked. It's not going to work even if you have machine learning in it. You're just reinforcing those same simple biases, those same simple procedural, you know, things where there's so much more nuance that could be explored. It's like they're not really interested. You know?
Well, one thing that you brought up, or one thing that you made me think of when you talk about law enforcement and bias is like even our own. Okay, so go with me on this, because I'm not defending police, but I'm just trying to. A lot of the way I think about machine learning is like I reflect it back to myself and go, could this inform me to think in a different way? And then I explore it, and then I come back. So I'm not afraid of changing my point of view by looking at the other side. So one thing that I kind of discovered when thinking about this is like, what's the word? Anecdotal evidence. So humans tend to have these anecdotal biases where like, if I, as a civilian, not a law enforcement, and I've, you know, fortunately never been shot at, but let's say I got a gun pulled out on me twice in 10 years, I would consider that a lot. That's a lot for me, right? As someone who's now never been pulled again. And then meanwhile, there are probably people who have had this happen so much that it's nothing. So like, that doesn't actually say much about like the effect it has on you, because 2 versus 10, but if you're in an area where you're like constantly pulling out guns, you may not be sensitive to that. So a computer though can actually parse out like in a lot of data, like, you know, measure the data of like emotions and everything, and you know, how often people are doing it, and just for these like outliers. And to me, when I think about the biases a lot of law enforcement have, because they do, and you know, I am generalizing, but also it is true. It's statistically true. And one thing we don't.
I think the number one bias is trying to be efficient, trying to be like gets.
Well, yes, but the other thing we don't
amount of time, which is you know.
Right, but the other thing we don't think about is law enforcement are humans like us with these cognitive biases. And okay, if you're in law enforcement, you're probably more at risk for getting into violent, scary situations. So even if you're like, you know, quote unquote, one of the good ones or whatever, let's say you're like totally unbiased, which is not possible. Everyone's biased.
Right.
But let's say you're like on the spectrum, a bit pretty like socially aware, grew up in a very like diversity of thought area. Like you really have been exposed to a lot of people of different backgrounds and, you know, beliefs, and you generally approach the world in a kind way. Even then, as someone in law enforcement, you may run into just more situations where you're caught off guard and you have to be on your guard. And so now your like cortisol levels are just higher in certain situations.
Yes. Yeah.
So even if you don't think you're biased, Like if you're someone who has like 5 black people pull a gun on you because you're in a situation where there's guns, you may have a bias without even realizing it that you think black people are dangerous, even though like you're just putting yourself in a situation like that. And that's anecdotal evidence that I think a computer could quickly discard, because a computer would be like, that's 5 people in how many people in the world? But as a person, you don't count all the people who didn't pull a gun on you. You don't count all the black people who didn't pull a gun on you, because it's too much data. You can't process that.
That's what I'm saying is that, but they're feeding with the databases that exist already. So that's like the bias being built in right away. Meaning that when that company sells to law enforcement, they cannot take the world's data and sell it to them. They could take the algorithm that they developed, maybe with the world's data that's really robust, give it to the police, but then the police have the rights to use only their data to feed it, to train it.
You're kind of describing like back to parenting, how parents pass on patterns, and if you aren't aware, you just continue the patterns.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know. And I really like hammering that home, but it's just, I'm kind of like opening my eyes to that now too. But I'm curious, so what for you was that moment? Like when you were learning this, did you have a moment like where you're like, aha, or like something just like really blew the door open where you're like, whoa, I never thought about things this way. This totally changes things? Or like,
I mean, all it's done for me is just let me know that we're just scratching the surface. And this is really, truly a whole new world that has to be looked at with very fresh eyes, and where we do have to kind of disregard a lot of our own patterns and biases and perceptions, like perspectives entirely. And like you said, like see things. And that's where it is helpful to get deep into the inner workings of what these convolutions are, what these neural network nodes are. It's actually literally
an example of one, like a moment, like even if it feels specific, like what you were working on, or like, I mean, whatever you can say, but like that made you think this.
Yeah, I mean, just literally looking at you can pull, if you're doing computer vision neural network, you can actually pull like the processing of that node and look at the image, and you'll see something that looks like, I mean, it looks like an acid trip, and it's really mind blowing, but that is, at that moment, that is the analysis of that image. And there could be like, oh my gosh, like there's patterns of things here that I never thought were there, and they're there and I see them. That's when it starts clicking, that you're like, oh, like a computer is able to see things that I have never seen. And it's like, and then when you start seeing them, it opens your eyes to them, and you do start seeing them. So now, like when I do look at things, I see things in vertical slices and horizontal slices and color gradients and depth maps, you know what I mean? Because like once you start realizing that that's the way computers see things, you realize the depth of information that our brain has to filter out, because we don't have time or need to actually take all that information in, right? We only need whatever, you know, there's an object here, I pick it up, you know, and I drink from it because it's a cup, whatever it is. So,
well, it's
so
kind
that's the
of
interesting
like
thing.
You're describing a little bit the idea of mirroring, not straight up like a mirror, but like even a computer, and analyzing a thing and giving you the grid or whatever that you're seeing. That's in a way mirroring, right? Because it doesn't, to have those thoughts, it doesn't need to show it to you, but you need to see what it's doing. So it needs to print out a mirror of what it's doing. And this is going to be such a stretch for you, I think, for me to bring this up, but I'm making a connection. Well, I read tarot sometimes for fun, and to me, a lot of like over time, I was like, I just want to learn and get better, and I've just been building it intuitively, so I probably fuck it up. But the way I do it from when I first started and now I kind of look, and I first just like look at patterns before I even look up anything and go, what am I feeling? What do I see? And I've kind of, in a way, like very slowly trained my brain computer to start seeing things that way. And those things were always there. I just didn't see them before. But now I see when cards have similar shapes and colors, and I see when they're contrasting with different places and different positions.
I don't think it's a stretch at all. I think you're hitting on exactly what we're talking about.
But that's the kind of thing that I would say, if I brought that into a Silicon Valley like tech room, I'd get laughed at. And that's why I feel
I think you're absolutely wrong. I think you'd be among peers.
So you think people are into a pseudoscience, because that's kind of like astrology and the occult, to me, feels so connected to the brain. It's a mirror for what we think.
Because they still exist, and they're here. And, you know what I mean? Like I think that true technologists and scientists, they are interested in the entire physical and emotional and spiritual world, because it's all there. It does affect our lives.
Information and data.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not saying that everyone would be like that. I mean, but that's how I look at it. I mean, my main thing.
A fun job would be in all these big rooms, because I think as things get more like closer to the singularity or whatever, there's everything needs to be more interdisciplinary, not because it really is, it's just that we're just meshing fields so fast. But I think a fun job that they'll probably never allow is like every kind of big room like that has everyone who spent a lot of time studying things should just have like one chaos wild card who's like a non-tech, non-academic person who might be bringing like experience, like let's say it's like a retired Olympic runner, whatever, but like just someone who has such a different life, so different where you almost don't know if it'll come in handy, and they just are there in the room to like ask stupid questions, but to also, because they're human, and if you're trying to create a universal algorithm, it's like, well, you guys all have the same brains. Yes, this guy is an Olympic medalist, but he probably still has, like, you'll bleed when you cut him, whatever. So like, it's whatever you introduce into humanity, I think has to touch on all these extremes.
Well, something I did notice with a lot of companies that even are tangentially with tech, meaning like they could just focus on one really small aspect of it. They started putting a lot more value in like data scientists, behavioral scientists, like library science, like a lot of like really interesting fields where it's like, and putting a lot of investment into empowering those teams, because instead of having kind of that guy in the room, they want someone who heads a department who looks at all that kind of like anomalous, non-related data. They have someone who's like really into visualizations. Like, I mean, I worked for a company for a number of years where we literally had a visualization guy. He would come up with wall-sized posters of like acid trippy looking like visualizations of data, but that was super important to wrap our heads around the expanse of what it is that we were talking about, to know that there was so many different perspectives of ways of looking at things. I think all those things have gained clout in scientific and data science communities, because you're looked at as very limited if you're only limiting yourself to like this narrow, linear, one-dimensional view of data. And that's what I mean. It's a very competitive field. So when we talk about like, algorithms that will be biased one way or another, I don't see that as much as a danger, because you're going to be called out on that and kind of cast away pretty quick. It's like pretty amateurish.
But that's implying that people who are getting hurt have a voice and power, which I think we do take for granted here in America, and it's starting to become more threatened. But there's a lot of places where people don't, like, I mean, China is an example where they're literally censored from using Google, and they are often at the forefront of technology because these companies don't have to think about ethics as much. But it does get into this but gets into this gray territory where you're not necessarily benefiting everyone, but maybe as a leader you think you're benefiting the overall country's image and growth, but how many people are you hurting? So I don't know. I think
and
it's tricky. It's really tricky. And that's where I get a little like, I know I wouldn't survive in the tech world, because a lot of it is driven by this analytical brain, which needs to be. Just to spend all the time with math and numbers, you have to be kind of driven by that, and it's profitable. But I kind of wish people spent more time ethically and philosophically thinking about, like, every other day should just be like, sit down and to have tea and just talk about your like childhood. And honestly, you're gonna have a much better Facebook if everyone at Facebook like talked about their childhood more at work.
But I will tell you where it is disappointing and hard for me is not so much in the people not being hurt, being not represented and stuff, because I think that a lot of that is so discussed in other circles of society. And I do look at our society, I mean, I'm extremely progressive, and I do look at us being more progressive than ever in our thoughts and more open and inclusive, and that really does feed into these technology companies and things like that, because a lot of times there's the same people that are on the kind of the forefront of the progressive thought experiments that feed into the technologies. But where it does disappoint me is economics. And it's, at the end of the day, economics rules the day. It is whatever is cheaper, whatever is going to make the most money. And that's where things fail ethically. And that's where it's just like all the time. Like, for example, you can create the most killer whatever application, machine learning, and the company will go and, hey, like this other company in China says they could do it faster because they don't have to deal with the ethics of data collection the way you do. So they can deliver it to us this much faster. It's going to be this much more effective. And you're kind of stuck. You're like, yeah, but they're not. It's kind of like factories in China, right? It's like, yeah, but the ethics aren't there. And it's like, yeah, we don't really care as much as we do about money. You know?
But see, this is where I think we can learn more from actually understanding brain development and history, because I watched American Factory. I don't know if you saw that documentary, but it was a few years ago. American Factory. It's produced
Yes,
by
yeah.
Higher Ground, the Obama's production company, but it kind of follows the GE plant when it got bought and reopened by a Chinese company. But as an American company, clearly the money was from China. It's very obvious in the way they did things. They tried to do it by the rules here, but they were just eventually very frustrated with the bureaucracy of America and how inefficient it was. And what I notice is like we've kind of come around, like for so long the Western world was exploiting a lot of the cheap labor in China, and now as they're getting wealthier, they're coming here to kind of exploit the labor here in the way that they've been trained to work. So even they were like, we're going to be slower because we know Americans are slow, but they didn't even realize how much slower. And then all the Americans complain, but it's like, well, why was it okay when you guys did it to them? And that really begs the question, because at the time they're like, well, we were paying them more than they were making. But shouldn't that be more of a sign that nobody should be making that little, right? So I think what I'm hearing, like I do agree with you about economical short term, like people want to make money now. But I think there are like these out of the box ways that if they started bringing in people who don't think so traditionally because they didn't go through the same academic path, could really break out of. Like, I mean, I don't want to go into software engineering. Well, I'll give you like a few examples I just thought of for fun, but I'm like, these are things that could totally work and wouldn't be hard and technology exists, right? Like, I mean, Uber is like a shitty company, but let's say a club that wanted to open. I was thinking reopen because they're all closed, but let's say a club that was, let's say clubs were reopened and one that wanted to promote, like you can using data instead of just being like, oh, this block has a lot of clubs, so it's a good place to go. They might be able to analyze, oh, it actually looks like when a really cool club is just like over 10 minutes away from the next nearest one, people tend to stay longer because it's good. So then using that, they might be like, well, what if to incentivize them to stay, we have like a deal with Uber. So like they can actually prepay, like clubs spend so much money on promo anyways. You get $10, which is pretty good, but it's just one drink for them. If you, stay between this window, or, you're there at close or whatever, and then you get an Uber home and it's free. And it's like, it's just a way to use marketing money, but in a more creative way. But it kind of it requires a little bit of like foundational thinking, right? Because it's a little bit more strategic than it is just like the app wouldn't exist without someone thinking this. Another idea, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say the way your brain is working is actually how you overcome that problem. Meaning, like when I was talking about the challenges of economics, at the end of the day, it means that it's a challenge. It means it's a business challenge, and that's something that we also face every day in developing this stuff. It's like then you have to come up with more creative, comprehensive, longer term. Like you just described. It's like you have to come up with more to overcome that economic barrier.
But I think a lot of the top money guys just. The reason they're so disconnected is because they don't necessarily live like everyone. So they're only analyzing behaviors from like a paper, and it feels like they're looking at ants and like, how do we take advantage? Whereas like, I mean, I'm sure there are, situations that I don't understand either, but all the ones I'm thinking about are the ones that affect me. So I feel like it's so important to have someone from communities that are being affected by technology in the
I absolutely
the quote
agree. I would love
room
that.
of it. Well, the other
and
one
something else that happens is they defer indefinitely. That's what I don't like either. Like meaning like Facebook can kind of say, well, we know there's a problem with ads and bots, and Twitter knows there's a problem with bots, but it's like we can fix it. We're working on it, but in the meantime, it's cool because we need
just
to
keep giving us your data, and we'll just make the world worse. Yeah. It's like you should have. So you should be on timeout. You should have to go away for a while. Well, okay, so here's another one because you brought up the China thing, and I just want to like put it in even like hammer this home even more. And I know to like a finance Wall Street guy, they'd be like, she's stupid, but I could make you money. Okay, I feel like helping people is actually very profitable if you do it in a way that isn't just helping people. Like ultimately, if people feel good, they'll want to spend money. If all their needs are met, they'll want to spend money. So people don't think like that because they want to hoard. But like, let's say a company in China was like, we'll do it for cheaper. But if you truly knew you had something like really great that like, oh my God, this is going to be amazing in 10 years. Like if someone wants cash in their pocket now, I mean, you could be like, literally the free year, like you can find ways that you're actually investing, and with knowledge, like these seem like risks, but if you really knew like, okay, well, China can do this quickly and cheap now because they're trying to get competitive, but we have all these like I don't know, let's say like your company actually has like a organic, what's the word, IP, whatever, brains that are like, okay, well, they're copying us, so that means they don't have anything original. Because if they did, they wouldn't be copying us. So why don't I actually make it like free for the first year, whatever, some incredible contract. But you're like, but my brains that I have and they're going to stick around are going to create the next thing. And by then we'll be locked in. And then nobody thinks like this because it seems risky. But I think this is why people need to focus more on getting all the information. Because if you could say, here's all the information, look, here's how much money we'll make in 3 years, and you can actually prove it, then people are like, okay, sounds good. But nobody wants that because it's scary.
But a lot of times these are kind of ingredient technologies that build a bigger product. And that's the thing too, is that like, as you go up the chain, you may have the team that's like kind of selecting this one ingredient technology, who the vendor is for that, but then they have to present. And then like, you know, that's one of like 10 items and the economics of that, you know, at the end of the day, it's like, we got to get this cheaper. I mean, there's just a lot more complexity to it. I think it's going to be kind of case by case, depending on the applications technology and the kind of company that wants to license it.
Can I tell you?
I don't mean to keep like, you know.
No, this is really good because it's good to like actually be able to match ideas up with reality, because I know a lot of people in the industry are thinking about these things, and it's just I don't hear it from their side. So I want to ask you a app idea. There's not really an app idea, but I've thought about like, how could I use data to help with what's going on now with COVID in LA? And so I have an idea, and I probably, there's many reasons why it wouldn't work, but I'm curious from you what you hear are the problems. So it's kind of a form of contact tracing, but I know ethically, like America, we wouldn't just be giving up all our data or all of our locations, even if I know they have that. Google has that. I know they can't just do that. But if there was an app where it was like, let's say it's between like the business bureau, whatever, I don't know what they're called, the municipality, like within the cities, they have, you know, like kind of coalitions of businesses. So let's say it was like sponsored by the city, and you can opt in, it's optional as a business. If you wanted to sort of join like one of the earlier phases to open, you would have to register kind of like a Yelp to be on this app. And then in order for people to go to your business in this phase, not forever, right? Because LA is kind of in a really bad place now. You would have to get the app. So let's say I really wanted to go to this restaurant downtown and they're on this app. And in order to go, I have to be on this app. So I would have to then check in to the app, like check in when I'm there, and maybe routinely get tested, let's say every 2 weeks or whatever. So now we have a closed network of businesses that are profiting and people who are enjoying. It seems like a win-win situation. The only thing that's scary is like there is contact tracing. So let's say someone does get COVID, you would get an alert like someone at a restaurant you went to, you know, got COVID, so now it's shutting down. But because it's so accurate, they just would have to go through the steps of like cleaning everything up, and you trust that if it's open, it's good. You know, 14 days closed down is better than not closed forever. And I think a lot of restaurants are scared to find the truth, which is that it's probably spreading faster than they think. But if we did this, I feel like people would opt in and it would make people money. But now I'm curious from a machine learning data guy, like what do you hear that you're like, this wouldn't work? Or like, why don't we do something? Why don't we do something like this?
Because I don't hear the problems on the technology side, honestly. Technology's all there, and that's all doable. I mean, just my gut reaction and where I think it would fail is that things are so open and chaotic in the US right now with the way things are running, is that any business is going to be very wary of something that provides any additional limitation to them doing more business right now, or anything that they want to do is just to increase business. So in order to limit people because they have to have this app, and then further open the door to maybe, you know, you're some other party knowing about your COVID status and you not being in control of the messaging behind that and what happens. I mean, I don't know. I mean, just right off the bat, I feel like there's so much distrust and fear and, you know, people really just wanting more than anything on the small business side of things to have the freedom to, you know, to increase commerce instead of limiting it in any way, you know, even though longer term it would, you know, what you're stating is that it would increase it over time, right? But that would have to build like a level of, there's kind of this period of building trust in it and kind of building the critical mass. That path almost, you know, it does relate to technology, because almost any like technological idea, they sound really good until you understand the pain it gets to that critical mass of users. I mean, that's where
you would have to start probably in a smaller closed town that's easier to control. But in this version, it's we just opened up and let loose, which is what we did, which clearly doesn't work. Like we were shut down, and then maybe like an early experimental stage of opening was like, okay, everyone's going to be allowed to open when we hit this good number, but there are a few people who have opted in who can open and sell things, but in order to do so, you have to opt. So it's almost like a better choice. But it would have been a good alternative to what we did, but we didn't do it. Which is just nothing. Well, okay, because this is also where we kind of just to tie it back. We're kind of nearing the end, but I want to tie it back to the beginning when you talked about objectives and what the equation is trying to solve is. What I kind of heard based on what you said of it would be. You said this would be good if everyone's goal was just to cure it in the long run. And if you asked everyone on the street, like, hey, do you want COVID to go away? We'd all be like, yeah. But then if you asked individually, like, do you want COVID to go away, or do you want to eat at your favorite restaurant tonight, even though it's going to hurt? Right. You'd be like, I want to eat at my favorite restaurant tonight. So now these computers, like, literally the computers in our brain are not doing the thing that they're saying they are, right? If all of our goals was actually to make COVID go away, I feel like, well, I mean, the writing's on the wall. What we're doing... Some other countries have done it. Yeah, what we're doing does not point to that is the goal, whatever people say. So then it's like, okay, so what is the goal? Because there is another goal. Like, there are other equations here doing things that are not just failing at our goal. They're maybe succeeding or failing, I don't know, but they're doing something else. So I think using that computer analogy helps to illustrate, like, we do sometimes have to just look at the behavior versus what people say, because it's not really, it clearly isn't the goal. Like, if it was, it wouldn't be this difficult. And you have to remove the human tendencies from that objective. But if we understand it, we could fold it in too. So I think there's ways to, Oh gosh, this is so, I mean, sorry, I feel like I'm definitely talking to you in circles, but this is also interesting to me. But we're kind of near the end, so well, we'll just to wrap up this conversation, and we can, I'm sure people can reach out. Well, maybe you'll give your plugs at the end and people can reach out to you or whatever, or if people want a second episode, let me know. But do you, as like kind of a wrap up, have any like advice for people? Like, what's something that's like a good practice that people should be thinking about? And you don't have to think too broad. It can be as simple as like something that doesn't feel tech related, but that you think people should be doing to kind of understand and be safe with their data and like how they perceive the world. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is I do wish people to be curious and really do take the time to understand the technology that they are using. Because I think a few of us are, like you are, and I am, but I do have a lot of friends that just kind of blindly trust whatever is trending, whatever is happening, whatever is, they want to use because it's whatever appeal it has to it. And then if I try to talk to them maybe about what's actually happening underneath, then they are very resistant to it because in a way it's like, don't ruin it for me, that kind of thing. Sure. But I mean, there's so many implications that are starting to come to fruition. And what I don't like is when people come around and say, like, for example, like, when they come around and say like, well, what do you mean like this company's using my data in this way? I didn't get permission for that. Or, what I mean? It's like, well, you actually did. I mean, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of like, well, did you read the terms of it? The terms Nobody ever does. Even knowing all this, I still don't read it. And I'm like, I know I'm not going to be able to, if I've agreed to, I'm going to do it no matter what, then it doesn't matter. I can't change. I can't be like, actually, I don't like this. Exactly. And I assume the worst. That's what I do. When I see a terms of service, I just assume the worst. So anyway, but I think that just increasing understanding, at least then as things develop, as things come out, then you have a little more, wherewithal about what's happening, and you can make some decisions, because there are going to be more policies and more, lawsuits and more. And I think that as a collective, public, the more informed we are about the nuances of these new areas that we're treading on, then we'll be able to kind of understand and make better decisions later on, and not leave it. What I don't like is when we kind of leave it to just the tech companies to self-police, and the, Congress who doesn't know what it, computer is, to try to manage that. It's like, no, we all have to kind of take a responsibility to understand the world that we live in. Yeah, so that's a really good way to put it. I think I try to look at the positives, because I think things are I'm so pessimist to begin with. Like I start where everything's negative and I'm like, well, I don't want it to get worse, even though it is pretty bad. But I don't mean that in a blind, oblivious way. And I like the way you said it. It's not about It's not about distrusting it. That's not the point. The point is getting more information, and it can change. It's like a person who's fast is not born at their fastest, even though genetically some people are faster than others. You still have to run, and like you'll probably like running because you're good at it, and you'll train and you'll get better. In the same way, like if you have these tendencies to want to learn, like it might be hard at first, but I think you should follow it. Like it's gonna get easier, and it'll help. It'll make you, I don't know. It'll make things better. That's my diatribe. Thank you so much for sharing this. Is there anything you want to plug? I know it doesn't have to be tech related. I know you're an artist as well. Like, where can people? Or I mean, you don't have to share, but if you want people to message you.
I'm pretty private. I mean, it's funny. I'm in a lot of creative circles, and I kind of do my thing. I mean, at some point, I will in the future. I have some philosophical stuff I'm working on that I want to kind of put out there, but it's not ready yet. So I'll let you know later on.
Okay, that sounds good. Oh well, since you brought up philosophy, maybe we'll end with this because I've been thinking about asking this more of people. And you'll have heard this question, and there's no right or wrong, but just curious how you answer. It's the trolley question. So just to reiterate for people who've never heard it, I think I'm remembering it right. You're driving a trolley, and if you go on, you're coming up to a junction, and if you keep going, you're going to run over one person, I think, and then if you switch, it's going to be three. It's like there's different stories. I think it's one where it's like there's like prisoners on one side, but I don't really like that one because it implies their life is worthless. So let's say there's 3 children in front of you playing, and if you switch it, you'll kill one grown adult man. And just to make things weirder, let's say he is an incel on Reddit and is a men's rights activist. Do you pull the switch? And you don't have time to do it. You only have time to pull the switch. There's no right or wrong answer, and there's also, I'm just curious how you answer.
So if I pull the switch,
have you ever thought about the trolley question?
No, I haven't really, because I don't think about things that don't really apply to me.
Okay. But isn't this a big philosophical question? What do you got? I mean, I'm only like hearing it from.
But I'm such a realist. I mean, that's not going to happen. You know what I mean?
So, well, that's one way to answer it. I mean,
my answer is I would never put myself on a trolley where this was possible, you know what I mean? But
that's a good answer. I mean, like I said, these are open-ended questions. Yeah, because oftentimes we get limited in the binary. You're given 2 choices in the question, but why do you trust me as the question asker? I didn't create the scenario, so there may be another way out. Okay, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you can follow this podcast at Tell Me Anything Pod, and follow me at Teresa T on Twitter and Instagram, and tell me what you would do or not do, or how you would answer to get out of answering it. Thank you so much.